Hi there, this is David at TED-IELTS, and today I'm going to show you a sample Band 9 answer for a recent IELTS writing Task 2 question. This question is a two-part question, and it's about food and sending food around the world. One of the students on my IELTS writing correction service sent this to me earlier today, actually, and it was a very interesting question that I'd never seen before, and I've marked thousands of essays for this service. And so because I'd never seen it before and I thought it was so interesting, I just wanted to share it with all of you today. Also, I was very happy with the sample answer that I wrote, and so I decided to just explain how I wrote it by looking at the process of analyzing the question, planning the answer, structuring the answer, and writing the answer, because I hope that this can help all of you at home to improve your IELTS writing skills. Okay, here's our question then. It says, today food travels thousands of miles from the farm to consumers. Why is this? And is this a positive or a negative trend? So this is a two-part question. So what we get is a sentence first. This will give you some sort of idea, some sort of concept. Then you'll have one question and then another question. When we get a question, a two-part question, it's actually very easy to structure the answer to this because you're just going to write one paragraph that answers the first question and one paragraph that answers the second. So in some ways, this is actually one of the easiest question types to answer. But first of all, we'll look at this and we'll analyze it. So what do we exactly have to do? So the first part of the question is always a sentence. Today, food travels thousands of miles from the farm to consumers. So that's pretty easy to understand. And don't think just in terms of farms, think of food producers. It could be fisheries, for example, or factories making processed food. And this is then sent by shipping containers across the seas from one country to another. We need to think of the reasons for this. In other words, why does this strange situation happen? And also to decide whether it's positive or negative. One thing that people don't always seem to understand is for IELTS, although it is an English test first and foremost, it's also kind of a thinking test, and you do need to be able to give realistic and intelligent answers. I often get students writing essays and they just don't have very good ideas. And whilst you aren't totally being judged on your ideas, if they're not very well developed or they're not believable, then you're not going to get a very good score for task response. I often get people, when they're asked why something is, they say, oh, this is boring or this is good. And these are not intelligent ideas. We need to give believable ideas. And I'll explain what I mean here. So when we look at a question for the first time, we should brainstorm. We should think of multiple different ideas, and then we can separate them into the good ideas and the bad ideas, and then we just focus on the good ones. So here, why does food travel thousands of miles from the producer to the consumer? Well, what I'm going to say is, first of all, not all food can be grown everywhere. Think about things like coffee and bananas. They can't be grown in cold countries, so we grow them in hot countries and send them and sell them to cold countries. I'm also going to mention that paradoxically, this is cheaper. I'll explain that when we look in more detail at my answer, because it's a very strange thing, but I think this is a very good idea to talk about. So that's going to be in my first body paragraph. In the second one, I'm going to talk about the idea of positive and negative. For me, it seems like it's mostly a negative thing, but that there's also a positive aspect as well. So in terms of negativity, I'm going to talk about the environment. I think that sending food around the world is bad for the environment. And I'm going to talk about exploitation, meaning I think that the farmers who grow this food in certain countries are not being treated fairly. However, there are some positive aspects that can't really be overlooked, such as the improvement to people's diets. So I would like to talk about that as well. When we're talking about task response and all these ideas, remember that what you're supposed to do for IELTS, and perhaps the most important thing, is to develop your ideas. So to explain them in a convincing way. Because the examiner doesn't have to agree with you. You can say something that's totally different from the examiner's personal beliefs. Maybe you think it's positive, they think it's negative. You're not going to get penalized as long as you can explain yourself clearly. So to develop your ideas by using explanations and by using examples, this is a great way of writing your essay. Also, make sure that you have the vocabulary to adequately explain all the things that you want to talk about. If you want to talk about, for example, the exploitation of workers in poor countries, but you think, I can't really think of the words and phrases I need to do this, then maybe cut that out of your essay and focus on something else instead. So once you know what you want to say in terms of idea, then you can think about the structure of your essay. Personally, I almost always write a 4-paragraph structure. Now, I've written, as I said, thousands of essays over the last few years. And I think that 4 paragraphs is basically perfect for all of them. Although some people like to write 5 paragraphs. That's not a terrible thing, and you can definitely write a good 5-paragraph essay. I've got a video up here about which one's better. Today, I'm just going to write 4 paragraphs because I think that's best for a 2-part essay question. The reason is that in an IELTS essay, you're going to have your introduction and your conclusion. And then for a 2-part question, you're going to have the first body paragraph answering the first question and the second one answering the second question. It's so easy to do this. So what we're going to have here then is we're going to have an introductory paragraph which sets up the main idea and tells the reader what to expect. The second paragraph is going to talk about the reasons why the situation happens. The third will weigh positives and negatives, and the fourth will be a conclusion. When you're thinking about structure, don't just think about your overall structure, as in the number of paragraphs. Also think about internal paragraph structure. Think about topic sentences, explanations, examples, and if you want to, a concluding sentence. Think about how to link each sentence. So are you going to use cohesive devices? Are you going to use conjunctive adverbs and subordinating conjunctions and coordinating conjunctions to link your clauses? You're going to have to organize your ideas, but also have a progression of ideas. And then you also need to think about how to link one paragraph to the next. Will you have a transitional sentence at the end of one paragraph, or a word or phrase that links back from the start of the next paragraph to the previous ones? So all of this is stuff that you need to think about. It's quite difficult to learn, but I feel that by reading a lot in English, you actually soak it up naturally and come to understand how this sort of thing works. But basically, your essay has to work together with every sentence related to and supporting every other sentence for the purpose of consistently answering the question in a direct way. Also, one last thing about this before we move on, don't overuse cohesive devices. These can be quite good to use in your essay, and your essay definitely should have some of them, but don't overuse them. This morning, actually, with another student, I was marking their essay, and every single sentence began with a conjunctive adverb. So this gives the essay an incredibly repetitive feel. It makes it mechanical, it makes it unnatural, and it just does not create a very good essay. Your ideas should be linked naturally, and you should use cohesive devices when necessary to relate the idea to your reader. Right, now let's look at my sample Band 9 answer and talk it through. So you can see it here on the screen. There are 4 paragraphs, as I've said. You can see my introduction and conclusion are quite short. I think this is important. Some people write very long introductions, and it's taking away from the main part of your essay. The development of your essay and your ideas really ought to be in the body paragraphs, so devote the most time and the most words to them. So, looking at my introduction, it says, it is very common now for food to travel large distances from producers to consumers. So this is a nice simple sentence that just captures the whole idea of the essay. It sets up the premise. You might think I've paraphrased the question. I guess I kind of have, but I didn't do it intentionally. When I'm looking at an essay like this, I get the idea into my head and I make sure I understand it. And then I write my first sentence. I'm not looking at the question and trying to copy it and change a few words. I'm just raising the idea of the essay in a way that conveys it perfectly to the reader. One thing you can do is imagine your reader cannot see the question. Can you describe the main issue in a way that will let them understand it without reading the question? I think this works nicely. My next sentence says, this essay will explain why that happens, and then suggests that it's partially a negative phenomenon, but that it has positive aspects. So I've not given all of my ideas up front. Some people like to explain all of their ideas here, but this just creates repetition. It's not necessary. What I've done is I've used that expression, this essay will, and you can say will discuss, will argue, will explore, and so forth. This tells the reader what to expect by telling them what's coming next. However, when you're asked about positive and negative, this is your opinion, and so you actually need to say a little more here. Remember that if a question ever asks for your opinion, you must put it into the introduction. It must be consistent throughout your whole essay. That's very, very important. A lot of people forget this, and it is specifically stated in the IELTS band descriptors. So remember that. Okay, so that was my introduction. It was short, it was simple, but it was very effective. Now we come to paragraph 2, and this is going to be all about the reasons why food is shipped around the world over thousands of miles to reach consumers. So I start off, to begin with, the main reason that food travels so far is because not all food products can be produced in all places. So this transitional phrase, to begin with, this just sets up the idea that this is going to be my first point. And then I say the main reason is, and by doing that, I'm telling the reader that this is the most important one. This is a great example of a topic sentence. A topic sentence is basically giving the main purpose of that paragraph or the most important part of that paragraph. So it puts across this idea that food products can't be grown everywhere. As you'll see in a moment, some things can only be grown in hot places. So this is putting across in one sentence the most important thing that the reader needs to know. But as I said, we need to develop everything, so I'm going to go on and write more. The next sentence is an example. For example, bananas only grow in tropical regions, and so they need to be shipped thousands of miles to reach consumers in colder parts of the world. So this is an example, but it's also an explanation because it builds upon the previous sentence to give more detail. So sometimes you would say topic sentence, explanation, example, but sometimes your example is an explanation. So we can't think too rigidly here. So my next sentence then, whilst it is true that they could probably be grown on a small scale in greenhouses in other places, this would drastically increase the price, which is in fact another reason for food traveling so far. So I've given my second reason here. There's two reasons given. And I've done it without the formulaic version of saying, firstly, the main reason is, secondly, it is expensive. So I've done it in a more natural, more effective, and more cohesive way. I've also introduced this word here, greenhouses. This is a good word because it relates to agriculture, it relates to food. It's a topic-specific word, so that's very helpful for your score for lexical resource. Although it may seem counterintuitive, food is often sent across oceans and continents to save money. So again, I've introduced a useful word and idea, counterintuitive, or specifically to seem counterintuitive. Counterintuitive means going against logic. So it seems like it's not sensible, but it is. And so this is my next point is being explained here, is the fact that to ship food all around the world it seems like it would be an expensive thing, but actually it's quite cheap. So this is why it's done. I'm going to explain that even more here. Even after shipping fees are paid, it is still cheaper to grow bananas in the tropics and sell them in London than it is to build vast greenhouses in England. So I've continued by building upon and explaining to put a clear idea in my reader's head of why it is that I think this is done. So food can't be grown everywhere, and it's actually cheaper, in spite of seeming like it couldn't be, to send it far away. So I think this paragraph functions very well by giving two extremely good reasons to explain the situation. They're explained clearly, and I've used this example of bananas, which I used in the second sentence here, and then I referred back to in the last sentence. So now I need to go on and answer the second question. Is it a positive or negative development? So to do that, I'm actually going to continue with this discussion. So I'll say this is obviously a very wasteful situation. Now notice the word this refers back to the idea from the previous paragraph. So already there's a connection between my paragraphs. Because food needs to be loaded into or onto ships, trains, and trucks in order to carry it large distances. So this is my topic sentence here, is the fact that it's a wasteful situation. I've introduced the idea of transport, and I'm going to explain this further. Many people are upset about the carbon footprint of such food items, and understandably so. So carbon footprint, this means the emissions, the negative, environmentally damaging emissions that come from something. So I'm basically explaining more about why using all these modes of transport is a bad thing. Now, I've said that this is what some people think, and when I say understandably so, that means I agree with them. I believe that they are right to be upset about this situation. So I don't like to think about advanced vocabulary because I don't think there necessarily is, but there's definitely less common and more useful phrases, and I think this falls into that category. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give two reasons why it's negative. So I'm going to move on to the next one now. I'll say, in addition, there are questions of exploitation to consider. So this is a short sentence to introduce the second idea, questions about exploitation. So exploitation is something I'll explain in a moment, but basically it means to do bad things, to get something from someone unfairly. Just like in my previous paragraph, I'm going to use an example to explain my idea. And here also, I'm going to continue with the same example. Now, by continuing with the same example of bananas, I'm keeping this narrative thread going through my whole essay. And this is something that good writers do to keep the reader interested, to keep the reader focused, to keep the idea, the main idea, focused, and to connect everything in a very logical way. So I'll say here, to continue with the idea of bananas, farmers in tropical regions do not always receive fair compensation. Fair compensation means an amount of money for their work that is fair and reasonable. I'll then explain by giving an example that shows how this works. When a banana is sold in London, there are profits taken by the supermarket, various transportation companies, governments, buyers and importers, as well as exporters, before the farmer receives any money. So my example is my explanation, and I'm staying consistent with this example to keep it focused and to illuminate and to show the reader very clearly why this is an unfair thing. So to develop the idea of exploitation and to relate back, though, to the reason of why this is done and connecting the negative to the reason of why it's done. I'm going to then have a short sentence that sort of concludes my negative part by saying, considering how cheap this is, it seems fundamentally unfair. So just further explanation and conclusion. However, as I said, it's mostly negative, but a little positive. So my last sentence is going to have a transition on the other hand, and then it's going to give the positive aspect. Remember, when you say on the other hand, you don't have to say on the one hand and on the other hand. You can just show one thing, and then when you introduce the opposite, you can say on the other hand. On the other hand, food is now sent all over the world, and undoubtedly this has improved people's diets and exposure to various nutrients, which is quite positive, whilst at the same time lowering the price of food, causing a reduction in world hunger. So when we're talking about vocabulary, you're not looking for really random words from the dictionary. There's always these idiots on YouTube that say, oh, you've got to use this one magical word or whatever. You need to use topic-specific vocabulary, language precisely related to the topic at hand. So here you've got words like various nutrients and reduction in world hunger that are directly related to the idea of food and the importation of food and the exportation of food around the world. Okay, so that paragraph very clearly and very effectively talked about the positive and negative. And it said, I mostly think of this as negative, but there's some positive. So it's a very reasonable, well explained set of ideas. Finally, we come to the conclusion. In conclusion, food is sent around the world for the seemingly paradoxical reason that it is cheaper than sourcing it locally. When I say seemingly paradoxical, it's kind of like going back to it may seem counterintuitive. So it's basically saying it seems ridiculous. It seems like it can't be true that sending food all this way is cheap, but actually it is. Sourcing it locally. To source something means to obtain, to find, and we use this when we buy food. Not personally buy food, but usually a supermarket buyer will go to a country and find bananas, for example, and they source it there. So this is another topic-specific word. This is negative environmental impacts and is ethically questionable, but does have some possible positive factors. Ethically questionable means it's basically unethical, but it's not extremely unethical. It's more like, in terms of ethics, it's a bit wrong, or it seems a bit wrong. So why then is this a Band 9 answer? Well, there's various things to consider. We're marking in 4 ways. There's task response, coherence and cohesion, lexical resource, and grammatical range and accuracy. In terms of task response, I've answered the question directly and fully. I have expanded upon my answers. I have made believable and intelligent answers, and I have used explanation and examples to illuminate them. A reader would look at this and they would understand it fully. They may disagree with me, but what I've said has been logical and sensible. In terms of coherence and cohesion, I have good paragraphing. My ideas are organized, and there is progression between them. I've used cohesive devices, but I've not overused them. My ideas are linked, and most importantly, as I've said a few times, I've got this example that works as a thread through the essay, joining everything together. You'll see that my paragraphs are connected and my sentences are connected. So everything works together with every sentence joined logically to answer the overall question. In terms of lexical resource, well, I'm a native speaker and I'm a professional writer and editor, so this is pretty easy for me. But importantly, I've not just used fancy words and rare words, I've used the right word for each situation. I've used topic-specific language, and I've used, yes, some uncommon words, but not completely random uncommon words, as some IELTS gurus will tell you. In terms of grammatical range and accuracy, again, I'm a native speaker, I'm a professional writer and editor, so that's pretty easy for me. But basically, there's no mistakes. But it's not just about accuracy, it's about range. So my sentences differ from one to the next, and they do so in a natural way. I've not tried to include every single grammatical structure I can, but I've just used the right grammar to get across each point. So I thought I would share this with you today because it was an interesting question and I thought it was a good answer to it. I hope that this has been helpful for you. If it has, consider subscribing and liking for more videos like this in the future. Goodbye.